So, kia ora morena. How you doing? So we've been doing a bit of a series, trying to explore loving your neighbour, loving God and loving your neighbour as yourself, which is tricky. And actually, but before I get into that, just to let you know, if you've been looking at the newsletter, there's a couple of events coming up on a Sunday night and a few other nights. We're running some vision-related evenings. We've gotten some basic work about our vision, and we're wanting to run it past some people and actually have a look and tie kick and this looking to flesh it out, see if there's better ways to say some things. So if you're free on Sunday night next week, and I think they're in the newsletter. The intention is not that you need to come to all of them, but if you're able to come to one, that would be lovely. Anyway, we're talking about trying to neighbour well. What does that look like? And some of the things we've done so far, we had a look at what I think was, we've had a form out here, there's copies of it out on the table out there, asking you to think, well, who are your neighbours, who are the people you're alongside, and think about, well, it's difficult to love someone if you don't know their name or anything about them, or if you're never connected with them. So, do you know their names? What do you know? And part of that is an invitation to think, how might I have more of a relationship? And then the first set of questions, I went looking for some help on this topic. I kind of figured, well, to get to know others, it's helpful if you can talk together, was looking for questions that might make meaningful conversations. And one of them was, where do you come from? Which is a great question. I still think if you're starting off with someone, a great question. People can answer it all sorts of different ways. And we all have some journey so far. And we had a Sunday where we did some, almost like speed dating, sort of short conversations together, just practicing this. Now, this is not because I think you're a terrible conversationalist. It may be because I am, rather than you. But a sense that actually, if we're wanting to connect with others, then part of it is this. Now, and I've gone about this not with the sense that I have all the answers. Okay, it's not that I believe that at all. I suspect that none of us have all the answers. So I went looking for outside sources, and they came up with this great set of questions, good questions, nice, safe questions you could move on to, but the next question that they came up with was a little less safe. And the question was, where do you hurt? Now, if that immediately makes you feel vulnerable, relax. I'm not going to ask you to talk to your neighbour about that. Okay, safe space. Okay. Everybody carries a measure of hurt in life. In Mark 5, Jesus has been approached by a man who has a sick kid who's dying, and he's on his way to help. And now, remember, so there's a level of hurt there, and there's a woman in the crowd that's been following him who's had internal bleeding, or has been bleeding for 12 years. And now, we've got a fantastic health system in New Zealand. I'm a huge fan. It is absolutely brilliant. If something is clear-cut, they'll discover it, and they will solve it as quickly as they can. And as a minister, I've seen that a whole bunch of times. I've also seen there are some conditions that are vague, difficult to pin down, and our health system can struggle with those. It's harder to know what to do with them. And this is a woman who probably has one of those things that's hard to pin down in their culture, almost impossible to pin down. And she's been bleeding for 12 years, which probably means that she's unclean, she can't engage in things the way that she might normally. And there is no medical system that's working that well for her. Mark points out that she has suffered under the care of many doctors and spent all she had, and her condition had got worse. So 12 years of quite harsh suffering. Now, if you've been on earth for a while, you'll have discovered that all of us carry hurt. Some of it's physical as you get older. The joints can complain. Getting up in the morning is not necessarily the great joy it is when you're young, not that it ever is then. The knee aches, the hip that's sore, the parts of the body that start the day with an ouch. But we also carry other hurts, don't we? We carry other hurts where maybe they're internal, things that have happened that have shaped us. This woman, after 12 years of struggling with a medical system, well, what would you say if you met her? The thing about hurt is it's best not to play comparison games with it. She's hurting, but you know, Hannah, in 1 Samuel, Hannah is longing for a child and has been unable to have one. And that happens over a long period of time, and so she carries hurt. David builds up a relationship with King Saul. You know, he's been really helpful. How do you reckon he feels then when Saul is trying to kill him and he's running away and hiding in a cave? He carries hurt. He even ends up in one case in front of another king having to pretend to be mentally ill, and he says, "Look and see, there's no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life." That's David in Psalm 142. No one gets through life pain-free, bruise-free. We carry hurt. Even worse, when David gets confronted by Nathan, caught out for manipulating a friend's death, and he says, "I know my transgressions, my sin is always before me." Not all of our hurt is other people's. We carry hurt. Living in a broken world and being a bit broken ourselves, we carry hurt and we hurt others. And in the West, we've got a really clear cause-effect mindset. We like to figure out, you got hurt, so how did that happen? How can we fix that? Yep, what's the story there? And that's helpful when we do that, and sometimes really unhelpful. The Bible tries to ride shotgun on that way of thinking. There's a book, the book of Job, that seems to exist pretty much to try and ride shotgun on this cause-effect. Because here is a person who's regarded as righteous, he's doing the right things, and then his business collapses, his house burns down, his family dies, and he gets some kind of monkeypox skin condition, and he sits in the ashes of his burnt down house and scrapes his skin with a bit of old pottery, and he did nothing wrong. Right? There is not a matter of straight cause and effect here. And at the end of the book, he says to God, "Come on, explain yourself." And God says, "Okay, well, when you can sit down and build a star system and birth a whale, we can have that conversation. But until then, I'll be God and you be human." A book to say that cause and effect is not always the case. Yep. So, let's not make any assumptions the woman's done anything wrong. She's carrying hurt. She has a painful medical condition. We all carry hurt. Now, I don't want to be dark and I don't want to live there, but I carry hurt. Do you know, some of the time I don't know I carry hurt? It's happened to you. You suddenly find yourself in conversation and something comes out and you go, "Oh, where did that come from?" And if they're really good friends, they might say, "Where did that come from, Colin?" And you go, "Oh, I've still got that hurt there." No, you're more mature than that. You don't have that issue. We carry hurt. Even Jesus carries hurt. As I've got older, I've come to understand that so does God. What it would be like for God the Father to watch his Son hanging on a cross, knowing you could intervene and stop this and let it happen. The heart of God carries hurt. It is the astonishing thing about the Christian God, is God comes to a human embracing hurt and pain. And how do we deal with that hurt and pain? What do you reckon? Well, we process it differently. Some people instantly need to talk it out. In the West, we kind of like to bury hurt, don't we? Low down enough so you can't see it. Certainly you come to church, public services, and we generally come wanting to look good, or at least not look bad. And at public gatherings, it can be embarrassing. I have strong memories. My mother died when I was in my 20s, and I have strong memories of the three of us, my two brothers and me, in the funeral, determinedly we weren't going to cry. So we successfully made it through the funeral without crying. I should get a medal or a kick in the pants. It was a really dumb thing to do. We carry hurt, and it can be embarrassing for people to see that, and even in church. In one of my first churches, there was a chap who would finish most services by crying. He just needed to cry. He carried a lot of hurt. And actually all he needed was someone to sit next to him, maybe pray a little bit, but just, it's okay. And that can be a frightening and embarrassing place if you've got hurt bursting up and no one else is. About a year after Linda and I got knocked off our bikes, I had my daughter diagnose me of having chronic pain, hip pain. And so I went to a physio, and to my shock and horror, to my shock, what I discovered is that I didn't really know when I was in pain. The first meeting was, can you just, I want you to take a note when you feel pain. And I want you to notice what else is happening there. And I kind of, after a wee while, I realized, I'm kind of not aware of this. So, tough question for us all, where do you hurt? In church circles, we like to pretend that it can all be fixed like that. And sometimes it can, but there's a lot of things people have to live their way through, endure their way through. Jesus does this. Things where there is no easy, quick solution, and so we wear grief like a heavy coat that it's hard to take off. And some of our grieving is day by day. It just kind of wears into us. Places where it can be hard to hold on to hope. So I did want to pause for a moment, just for you, and ask you to consider and maybe have an internal conversation with God for a minute or so. For you and your life, where are you carrying hurt? And then there's a second question in here, just kind of what are the things you're realizing, I'm just having to live my way through this. So this is a chance for you, for a moment, to reflect on that. And after 30 seconds or a minute, I'll jump back in. So for you to think about the cases, where do you carry hurt? What are the things you're living through? Now, there's clearly no sense of judgment for whatever position you find yourself in. It might be at this stage appropriate to say, hang on, we're talking about talking with others. How come you're talking about us? I think if we're going to ask someone a question that allows them to talk about their hurt, then we need to be aware of our own. In the Ignatian prayer tradition, they have these two words, consolation and desolation. What they're trying to say, they try and ask people to pay attention to this. They say there are in our lives at all times movements towards God and away from God. Okay, they're just unfolding. And so they ask prayers to notice, the movements towards God they call consolation, and the movements where you recognize I'm moving away from God. Actually, I just don't want to spend time with God. They call them desolations. Consolation, they think, is getting more taken up in the love of God, growing in faith, love and hope, being strengthened and encouraged, a desire to serve God and connect with God in all things. And desolation is described as darkness, emptiness, lazy complacency, inner turmoil, sadness, despair, selfishness, rebellion, feeling distance from God. And they say it's not so much about your feeling, but they say if you think of your life as a computer screen, then you could say consolation means God is on the computer screen. It's not that life is perfect, but you've got a sort of sense of, yes, God, you're with me in this. And desolation is with, no, there's no God there. So it's a good question for pain is just to think, what's it doing to you? Is it pushing you towards God or away? Is what you're experiencing something that is? And if you find yourself in a place of desolation, if you find yourself in a place of consolation, nice thing to talk about with God and say, thank you, God. I'm really appreciating your presence. And if you find yourself in a place where you're moving away from God, the Ignatians would say, that too is something to talk with God about. What's going on, God? Why am I finding this position? Can you help me? Another even briefer pause. What is your hurt doing to you? Is it pushing you towards God? Or is it pushing you away? Okay. Look, I've failed to build a biblical argument for me, but it's an argument for this, but it does seem to be that if you are able to talk about the places of hurt with other people, then what happens is you get some of them from locked up inside of you out in front of you, and they can be looked at. There's some value in talking about hurt with others. But this is not something you're going to just... I've got 1 minute free as I pass someone in the supermarket. Am I going to ask, where does it hurt? No. It is actually, I think, quite a legitimate question to ask, where does it hurt? Because we do carry this. In the story we started with in Mark 5, when she hears about Jesus, she comes up behind him and touches his cloak because she thinks, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And immediately her bleeding stops and she feels in her body she's free from her suffering, which is just magic, isn't it? Fantastic, happy story. Story can stop there. Bleeding's gone away. Well done, Jesus, you've done the thing. But no, the moment Jesus realizes that power's gone out of him, he turns around and says, who touched my clothes? And the disciples think you're crazy because there's so many people jostling around. And he won't let it go. He keeps looking around. And then the woman, knowing what happens, comes and falls at his feet, scared. She's stolen his power. And he says to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, be freed from your suffering. It wasn't good enough for Jesus just for the healing to take place, the physical healing. He wanted some kind of relationship. I think he wanted to know she's loved and healed. The pain and hurt that we live with that is not instantly solved, we live our way through, and I think we are loved our way through. We're called not to converse with our neighbours, though clearly that we're trying to, but to love them. The promise of healing in Jesus goes along with promises of suffering and the need to endure and count it all joy. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 12 about being given a thorn in my flesh that torments him. And he asks God to take it away. And God's reply is, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Now, God still does heal people, but we carry hurt. Lots of people carry hurt. And when you deal with someone who is hurting, and that's most of us, probably good to put down some of your agendas. You don't rush here. Where does it hurt? Only a fool rushes here, and there are some fools. If you ask the woman who spent 12 years struggling with a bleeding disorder, you'd better have time. You better not rush off. And it might be good not to say too much. It may be good to let her set the agenda, which doesn't always happen. This lady in the background is Amy Kenny. She's written a book called My Body Is Not a Prayer Request. She lives with disability, and here's how the book starts. God told me to pray for you, she says. Her words linger like cloying perfume in a claustrophobic space. God wants to heal you, and she's undoubtedly thrilled with this opportunity. Amy writes, I've been here before, it never ends well. This woman does not know me. She doesn't have the intimacy that prayer or accountability or sarcasm require. She simply interprets my cane as something that needs fixing and ropes God into her ableism, the belief that disabled people are less valuable or less human than our non-disabled counterparts. She writes, internally I make a swift calculation, endure the prayer to avoid a squabble, or call her out on her benevolent eugenics and be branded a heretic again. I'll just read one sentence of that before. She doesn't have the intimacy that prayer or accountability or sarcasm require. What's she missing? She's missing relationship. I had a brief experience of this after my accident. when I was in crutches, and in a couple of meeting settings, I was pounced on by well-minded people who wanted to pray for my hip. They wanted to fix me. And I would have very happily been fixed. But that probably wasn't the thing that I wanted more. In those cases, none of them said, "What would you like me to pray?" Or, "How's it going, Colin?" Or even asked afterwards. They wanted the fix. And actually, I didn't really like that. Amy rightly says that her body, disabled though it is as much a temple of the Holy Spirit as is anyone's. So maybe where do you hurt is not a question for everyone, all people, all times, but it's worth asking. There are times. I have a minister friend who's very bad with people. I think he's terrible with people. It's not me. And he has seemingly no emotional intelligence, but in a meeting, when someone gets heated, do you know what he says? He says, "There's a lot of emotion in what you're saying." And then he pauses. Gosh, it's good. As soon as he names it as emotion, people tell him about it. And it's like, I'm kind of amazed by the guy, because I've always thought, everybody's on a scale. And yet he's just learned to say, there's emotion in it. I'm sensing emotion in how you speak. Are you feeling angry about something? And then he just steps back and off they go. It's really impressive. I want to summarize, and then I've asked Anita to come up and just a little conversation about this. Everybody carries hurt. We all have things we live through, and I don't think there's a simple formula for that. Love carries us through. I think there are times when it's worth asking, is the things happening in my life, are they pulling me towards God or pushing me away? What do I do about that? And then I'd say, actually, I'd love to be in the position to have this conversation. But it takes time, and I think that if we go there, then we need to be very careful of our agendas.